that, Ron?
More or less.
More or less, okay.
It's been a challenge so far, so we'll see how this goes.
Changing the screens around, eh?
What?
Changing the screens around.
Yeah, right.
This is nice, you got a column right here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the Planning Board. So, as you said, I'll go through a brief PowerPoint presentation highlighting the components of the proposed program and then turn it over to you for questions and comments and public input. So I guess the first item of discussion is, where is this idea coming from? And it started back in, probably 5 or 7 years ago with the drafting of the current comprehensive plan for the town. And during that drafting process, there was discussion about a desire to have the town promote preservation of historic structures and resources in town. So and that was incorporated into the comprehensive plan, and within the plan are these two items. There's a goal, C1, save National Register and other historical and architecturally significant properties and natural heritage sites. And under that goal, there's an action item that the town should adopt ordinances to require historically correct restoration of historic buildings and to discourage demolition or inappropriate use of valuable historic resources. So as you know, the Planning Board is responsible for implementing the town's comprehensive plan, and as we were going through the process of addressing those action items in the plan, we came to this item, and the Planning Board established a subcommittee to begin consideration of how best to implement this action item. After much discussion and input from folks from the outside, the Historic Society and others, there was a decision and, well, I guess it's a recommendation at this point, to proceed rather than with a regulatory approach, have an incentive approach towards promoting historic preservation within the town. So the program that I'll go through tonight is based on that idea. It's an incentive-based program. It's not a regulatory program. And the idea is to promote individual residents to preserve structures that are structures and other resources that are historically significant. I guess what I also want to mention to you tonight is that the announcement for this meeting was posted on the website. It was advertised in the paper, and we also sent mailings to property owners within the town that, in the staff's opinion, we felt had the potential to benefit from this program should they choose to participate in it. So the notices were sent to property owners of those properties that had been identified in prior efforts of the town going back 20 or more years, where a couple of documents were produced that listed some historically significant properties. So we identified those, sent mailings to the current property owners for those properties. We also notified farm properties that we'd identified in a prior effort as farms. And the reason for that is, even though there may not be a structure on the property or historically significant structure, the property itself may contain resources that could potentially qualify for the program as it's currently drafted, whether that's archaeological sites, historic stone walls, and that sort of thing. So there was a significant mailing done. I think it was around 300 people that were sent a notice. So we made our best effort to get the word out there and to hopefully generate some interest and conversation. So as I mentioned, this program will be incentives. It's not regulations. It doesn't create a historic district by any means. It as the note says, it encourages good stewardship of historic resources in town. And it's entirely voluntary. It would be up to private property owners to determine whether they wish to participate in the program or not. The way the program would operate, it would start with the creation of a Historic Resources Board, and that board, once created, would have the responsibility to create a list of historically significant resources and those properties and resources that would be eligible to participate in the program. The board would be created by the town council. It would be made up of 5, at least as currently drafted, 5 full members and 2 alternate members, with one of the members having to be a member of the Middletown Historical Society, or we would offer them an opportunity to assign somebody to one of the seats on this new board. The program, as proposed, would include 3 different types of incentives that a property owner might be able to take advantage of: an annual tax credit, a one-time tax credit for rehab of properties, and then a density bonus for developers, and that density bonus applies in a situation where a subdivision involves a property with a historic structure on it, and if the property owner agrees to preserve that structure, they would be granted a bonus of 1 development lot in exchange for doing that. So I just went through that. So as I said, the board would develop the historic resources list. Properties on the list would be eligible. There would be an opportunity, the list would offer an opportunity for 2 different types of resources, a primary and a secondary resource. Primary resources are what you would expect in a historic structure, whether it's a home or other building that's, again, has been identified in the past or through the new process of identifying structures as being historic or architecturally significant. And then secondary resources would be landscapes, cemeteries, other items like stone walls or archaeological sites. Those would be considered the secondary resources, and I'll go through what the difference means in terms of the incentives. So as I said, there's 3 different types of incentives. The first incentive is for an annual property tax exemption, and this would apply, again, to either primary or secondary resources. If it's a primary resource, again, meaning a historic structure that's been identified by the board, it would be eligible for up to a 10% tax exemption from its value. So the tax value would be reduced by 10% over the course of the program. That would be a 10-year contract, basically, or an agreement that a property owner would enter with the town. In exchange for that 10% reduction, they would commit to, within that 10-year period, of not adversely altering the historic resource. If it was a secondary resource, they would be eligible for the 5% assessed value reduction. As it's drafted now, recognizing that there are some properties of significant value out there, and recognizing the potential impact on tax revenue for the town, the current draft would limit the exemption to 10%. The 10% is based on the median home value in the town. So you could get no more of an exemption than what the median home value would give you. So if you've got, a multi-million-dollar house, you're not taking 10% off that several million-dollar assessment. It's going to be based on the median home value. And again, the concern was for the impacts on tax revenue. As noted in the last bullet here, if someone were to enter the program, receive those tax benefits for a period of time, and then are found to not be complying with the conditions of the program, or they wish to exit the program, They can do that, but they'd have to recoup, or the town would recoup the tax benefit that was granted for whatever period of time that resource was in the program. Once that 10-year period expires, it's up to the property owner. They can choose to re-up, or they can exit the program, at no penalty. Once you're in the program, that 10-year program, any exterior alterations to the building would have to be approved by the Historic Resources Board. I just mentioned that the property owner may terminate the contract provided that the repayment is made. Upon sale of a structure that's within the program, that contract is basically null and void, whether the 10 years has elapsed or not, and the owner would not be subject to repaying the benefit. There's really no, and I think we talked with the solicitor about this, there's no way to have that contract extend into the new ownership or to adversely impact the property owner if he ends up selling the property before the end of that 10 years. So this is just an example of how it would work. In these numbers, all of the numbers I'm showing you tonight are very rough numbers. They're not necessarily the current numbers. These calculations were made probably about a year ago as we were working through the beginnings of the program, so it's not necessarily based on current tax rates, but it gives you an idea of the dollar figures that we're talking about. Roughly medium assessed value in town is $345,000 with a rough annual tax bill of $4,700, and obviously the 10% reduction would grant you that benefit of around $474, and over the 10 years, there's your number. Ineligible resources, so this is primarily talking to secondary resources. Any stone walls that are protected under the town's ordinance would not be eligible, and those are walls that are property boundary walls along public rights of way. Those are the walls that are protected under the town's ordinance. Historic cemeteries that have been identified as historic cemeteries have certain protections under state law, so that they're not eligible for any benefit. And any other historic resources that are protected otherwise by deeds or other limitations, we're certainly not incentivizing properties that are already protected. The second incentive is regarding restoration of properties of historic. Again, these would be properties that are on the list that is established by the board. If someone wishes to participate in or undertake a rehabilitation of the property, they would be eligible to apply for a one-time benefit equal up to 10% of the cost of the rehab. The idea being there is that you want to promote preservation of the structures, enhancement of the structures in a historically accurate fashion. Again, the 10% and 5%, as with the prior provision, is similar. You get 10% for the primary structure, primary resource, 5% for a secondary resource. Probably obvious, but we say it anyway, you can't get a tax benefit above what your tax bill is. The town's not going to write you a check. So if your rehab project, 10% of your rehab project cost equals or exceeds your tax bill, then you can get up to 100% of your tax bill, just for that one time. But that would be it. And again, it's all, as with the prior one, it's also tied to the median home value in town, so there is that limitation on the maximum that would be paid. When you're under this program, when you were seeking to do a rehabilitation project, you would go to the board. You would have to get a certificate of appropriateness for the work that you're proposing to do, and the board would have to approve that what you're doing in order to get that one-time benefit is consistent with the town standards that would be also adopted by the board. Also proposed in the ordinance is reduction of permit fees. And as it states, you could use the program towards rebuilding after a disaster. And then this is just another example. If you've reached that maximum credit, so again, if you're basing it on a median home price, $345,000, the maximum credit you would be able to get is $4,744 based on these examples. So regardless of what the rehab cost is, that would be your maximum benefit, that one-time tax exemption. Example of ineligible projects, and I guess I would just again remind you this is a very early draft, and we'll hopefully get some good input tonight. Window boxes would be exempt, replacing or additions of exterior lighting, flagpoles, gates, fences, and that sort of thing. Those would not be eligible projects under this rehab program. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the third potential incentive is the density bonus, and this is mainly would only apply to major subdivision applications and only in conservation subdivision developments where there's some flexibility in how the lots are configured. If there's an historic structure on the property and the developer or the owner wishes to preserve that structure and is willing to have a deed restriction placed on that structure that it cannot be demolished, they would have the opportunity to gain one additional unit on the property than would be allowed by the town regulations normally. So obviously the intent and the goal is to preserve historic structures rather than having someone just tear the house down to build a new house. We did some very rough calculations, and again, these numbers aren't necessarily current. Just ballparking, I mean, I'm not going to go through each of these items, but I talked about this at the last planning board meeting. We're looking at roughly an annual total benefit to all those participating in the program based on some assumptions of around $100,000, give or take. And the assumptions are that there will be a certain percentage of eligible property owners that take advantage of the program. Either of the programs, the annual tax assessment benefit or the one-time rehab benefit. So there's different ways of doing the calculations, but what we see is in the ballpark of about $100,000 impact on tax revenue total annually if this program is implemented and it has some level of success based on these assumptions. So that's something that the planning board, we've talked about this before, the planning board needs to take that into consideration as you decide on how to proceed, if to proceed and how to proceed with the program. There'll be need to do some more fine-tuning of the calculations. If this is to move to the next stage of final drafting and then ultimately to the town council, we'll want to have some much better numbers in terms of what the impact on the town might be in terms of revenue. Just additional items within the program, property owners may receive both the annual reduction and the rehab reduction if they choose to take part in both of those programs. Enforcement will be done by the building inspection department. The program itself, the staffing of the Historic Resources Board, staff, doing research and that sort of thing. That would be through the planning department. But when it comes to enforcement of the program, the proposal now is to have that go through the building inspector's office. There's an incentive, it's not an incentive, there's an encouragement within the program to also have the town preserve any of its own public buildings that might qualify and be identified in that historic resources list. And as noted, the Historic Resources Board may choose to create programs, educational programs to encourage participation in the program. So that's it in a nutshell. I think the purpose for tonight's meeting, as I said, is to get the highlights out there, invite public input into the program, ideas, thoughts on whether there might be interest from property owners in the program, concerns that there might be. Again, it's sort of a hot topic in town right now is revenue and what reaction there might be in terms of the proposed tax benefits. So any of that, I think the board wants to hear tonight. The next step would be if the board chooses to have this proceed, as I just mentioned, I think we need to have another good run through with the solicitor's office, because I noticed as reading through it again this afternoon, there are some areas that need to be tightened up, some of the language, and then also work with the tax assessor to really nail down the tax revenue implications of the program should it proceed. So that's what I have.
Thank you, Ron. Before I open it up to the planning board, for the benefit of the public, there is a very good summary sheet that was prepared that's out there on the table. It's on the back side of the middle pile in case you missed it. But it's a very good summary sheet that describes what Ron was talking about. Comments?
Yes, as an aside, that Betty Jean Owen, who is on our planning board, is home ill tonight. And Betty Jean, this is a favorite project of hers. She spent a lot of time and energy when we built the new comp plan a few years ago. So I want to give her full credit for bringing this to our attention and to the towns and hopefully to the town council.
Thank you, Art. That's very good. Bill?
Question, thank you. Yeah, thanks. I agree, Art, that's BJ, it's certainly one of her projects. I also want to give credit to the staff and also Kevin, right? Kevin
Yes.
was a huge part of this. Kevin, his last name?
Proft.
Proft.
Yeah.
Yes, Kevin, wherever you are out there, thank you.
He's in Woonsocket.
He worked hard on this,
Yeah.
as did Rita and Ron, so I want to give them credit. Ron, a couple of questions. Just like you said, the process. We could, tonight, if we go through, you want to tighten it up so we have a public hearing or a public input tonight, and then assuming we probably come back maybe next month, and assuming it flies, or at what point it flies, we send it back to the council. And then if the council tweaks it, they could tweak numbers and revenue and all that good stuff. Does it then ultimately come back to us for like a public hearing for a new ordinance like it typically does? Is that the process?
I don't think it would need to come back. It's not a zoning ordinance, so
Oh, okay.
that there is a
Right.
difference there. It's not a zoning ordinance. It would be a separate code section. So then I guess it would be up to the town council. If they receive this but want to make significant revisions that they would like to have the planning board
I
look
see,
at, then
okay.
they could do that.
That was my point then, I
Yeah.
guess, thank you. And then I think you touched on it right towards the end. There are provisions in here to account for potentially historical documents and other resources, because I know the ordinance is designed to address, it covers much of incentives for preserving structures and properties, but we have accounted for documents. We did not.
Not documents, no. We talked a little bit about that, but this is really about, for lack of a better term, physical resources,
Okay.
structures. Like I said, the secondary resources would be things like cemeteries, stone walls, archaeological sites,
Right.
but not documents.
I mean,
It's also photographs.
photographs, yeah. None of that was touched, okay. But it doesn't prohibit the board from looking at it and maybe offering an education on it, or give guidance to the town on how to potentially do that preservation.
And as we talked about previously, at least in the subcommittee too, that the Middletown Historical Society would be intimately involved in all of this.
Yeah.
They
Okay.
would likely have at least one member on this new
Sure.
board, and there can always be that back and forth dialogue. I guess in my mind, that would be the body, the Historical Society, that would be the body that would be more towards preserving, whether it's photographs and other documents.
We can work closely on that, that's good, thank you. Under your additional items slide, it's addressed as the enforcement is done through the building official's office. What about the administration of the program? Is that done through your office?
Yeah, so that the administration and the Historic Resources Board would basically run out of the planning department. So similar to as we do with the planning board, before meetings, we would prepare the agendas and the documents.
Right.
Anyone seeking to take advantage of the program for any of the proposed benefits would go to the Historic Resources Board and request approval. So we would support those meetings as we do with the other boards.
And I know we talked about it a year ago or whatever it was, the resources out of your office to do this. It potentially could be it's potentially could be a fair amount of work there. But there's no, I just want it to be known that the staff already seems to be taxed pretty well, and to add one more layer of review is certainly appreciated if this flies, but it's noted that our staff is one of the best staffs in the state, I maintain, and to continue to burden you with additional work without additional staffing is something that I think the town should consider. I think it's appropriate considering the level of service we provide, so that's just my 2 cents.
No, I
on it.
appreciate that, and what I would expect, if this is adopted, at the early point of the adoption, once people learn about the program, it's going to be ramping up, and I think we'll have a lot of work at the beginning of the program. Once it's up and running, I don't think it'll be as much work. So there may be some need
That's
for
good.
maybe even just temporary assistance at the early stages.
Sure,
Yeah.
okay. My last question is to go back to incentive slide number 2, I guess on page number 6. Can you maybe give a better example? Because I know revenue is going to be the biggest probably hit at the council, and maybe some of may feel uncomfortable about.
Which one are you looking at?
Page incentives on number 2. Yeah, that's it.
This one?
No, page 6.
I don't have page numbers on the presentation.
Yeah, so it's is that
Incentive 1 or 2. Page
incentive number 2.
The first incentive 2 slide.
The first incentive 2 slide, yeah. That's it.
All right.
That's it. So maybe can you give a better or an example of this again? I just want to go through it for the sake of understanding the potential revenue hit that we could take on this.
So if someone wishes to rehab their structure that's been qualified, it's an eligible structure, the property owner would be eligible for a tax abatement equal to no more than 10% of the cost of the rehab.
Right.
It's going to be severely limited by the actual tax on the property because you can't give a benefit more than what the tax bill is. So I was going to use an example. If it's a $50,000 rehab,
Well,
then
maybe the next slide is where you gave that $60,000. That was the one. Yeah,
Yep.
that was the one. So maybe that's a better example. Maybe you could follow. Am I following this right, or?
so yeah, I mean the benefit is going to be limited to 10% of the value of the. So this first one, the $40,000 project, 10% of that is $4,000. But that assumes that your tax bill is over $4,000 because you can't get a benefit more than what your tax bill is. And it's just for that 1 year.
So potentially it's a 100% of the property tax
Right.
on a one-time.
One time, 1 year, yep.
Do we? Okay.
But again, it's all tied to that median home value in town too. So
Sure.
it is going to be limited.
And that's a pretty good
Incentive,
incentive.
yeah.
Sure.
But I think there's room there for, I think that's where we're going, where I think there's going to be some turnover, revenue lost, but I'm good, thank you, Mr.
But
Chairman.
he made an estimate of revenue loss, and it was not so
Yeah,
bad.
no, agreed on that, yeah, sure. Thank you,
You all
Ron.
set?
I'm good, thank you.
Questions? Mike?
So the historic board will put together a list of properties that they deem eligible for this
Right.
incentive?
Yeah, so what we've been referring to as we started working on this, there's two documents, and they're actually, I think they might be actually cited in the ordinance draft. There's a 1979 document, Historic and Architectural Resources of Middletown. I have this in the office if you wanted to look through it. It's outdated now. Some of the structures that are in this report are gone. This is one starting place, and then in 1990, another document, which is actually based heavily on this earlier document, was produced. So these two documents would be the starting point for this new board to create its inventory. They would go through these documents and whatever other information they have to identify properties that would be deemed eligible. Any property owner that doesn't end up on that list, and this is within the ordinance language, would have the opportunity to petition the board to have their property deemed eligible, and it would be up to the board to make that decision. But it would be that new Historic Resources Board that would be responsible for creating that list.
So if you have maybe a farmhouse that you think is of historical significance, maybe it was built in 1900, I don't know if that's too new to be considered, for something like this.
The way the ordinance is drafted, 1940 is the date. Anything before 1940 would be considered maybe not automatically eligible, but it would be an eligible property for review. The ordinance also talks about architecturally significant properties without specific definition yet, because we're not at that point. That's something that this board would have to also determine. But architecturally significant properties after 1940, at any point after 1940, could also be included on that list of being eligible. But again, the board's going to have to determine what the criteria would be to get a property that's newer on the list.
Didn't we talk about a standard that could be applied there, that?
For the historic properties, we were looking at federal standards.
Right.
I don't know that we get into any depth on the architecturally significant properties.
So we have to come up with something, or?
I
Somebody does.
think there was a bit of a punt going on there.
Yes, I remember that.
To the new board, where that new board, once it's created. So, as we're talking about this, it becomes fairly obvious that the program implementation is going to take a little bit of time, because this board first needs to be created, and then the board needs to create this list of eligible properties. So it's not like on day one, we've got a program and people can start applying. There will be a process.
They also have to develop criteria that they're going to use.
Right, exactly,
so,
yep,
And then the ability, I'm sorry, to petition to be added to this list.
right,
That's in the ordinance already.
yeah.
Do you have anything more, Mike?
No, most
No?
thanks.
You all set? I have some comments, questions. Looking at the draft of the ordinance on page 2 under the definitions, we don't have natural landscapes in there. And I was trying to think, maybe it's not there because there's no work that's going to be done to give them the incentive. However, suppose the bird sanctuary gets in trouble and they decide to sell the property with hanging rock, and somebody wants to build a house on it. How do you protect hanging rock?
Buy it.
Buy it? Buy it, okay.
I mean, there is, the state has the farm forest and open space
Well, but, I mean, that's an example. Shouldn't natural landscapes be in here somewhere?
Well, that's not an approach we took in drafting it. This is more towards architecturally significant property, historically significant properties and resources, not natural areas.
I mean, another example are beachfronts. You know, you want to protect your
How
beachfronts.
about historic landmark?
Well, but a landmark could be interpreted other ways as well.
Well, I think, as Peter suggested, there's other potential programs for such preservation. So that this is, it is what it is. It's meant to be looking at historic and,
The comp plan, the language of the comp plan is specific to historic resources.
Well, I said landscapes in the comp plan.
Yes,
But it
there
didn't-
are also,
it
I mean,
didn't,
for example, you could have a property that has that the Frederick, Mr. Broder's going to correct me, from a homestead design landscape or something of that sort, a historically designed landscape. You have to come up with the criteria for what types of landscape would qualify, but presumably it's a historic landscape, perhaps designed by a famous landscape architect.
Nature is pretty good at designing landscapes. I'll go on to another question. In your presentation, you mentioned that the incentive to give an extra lot to a developer applies only for conservation development. The planning board is in the process of hoping to get the town council to approve the ability to choose a conventional or a conservation. Which comes first? Would the planning board have their choice before the historic incentives kick in, or is it vice versa?
well, with the new program, with the new amendments to the conservation and subdivision regulations, the board is going to have the choice. The applicant provides two plans. If the applicant either approaches the board and says, I've got a historic structure on this property, I'd like to preserve it, and in exchange, I'd like to get the benefit, then the only option really is to go with the conservation plan.
Well, you could go with conventional and allow them to have smaller lots, just like you do in conservation development.
Well, then, I think that's a conservation development then, yeah.
Works itself out. It works itself out
Yeah.
based on, you don't think so?
Well, the only thing I have in mind is when we look at some of the conservation development plans that have been put forward, giving them an extra lot, I think, does not do the town justice. So the tendency might be to favor the conventional development, but then they lose that incentive. So I was wondering,
Well, we can look at it again and see if there's a way of doing that, but again, I think the concern was if you try to make it a conventional development, but then you're reducing the lot sizes.
Yeah.
We're early on still, I think, in the drafting process, and we can take another look at that.
One last question. You mentioned that if somebody applies for an incentive and receives it, and then later reneges, the town could recoup the benefit, the financial benefits that they've received. If this is has that been thought out, that recoupment process? For example, if somebody adheres to the guidelines and the restrictions for 9 of the 10 years, do they have to pay everything back, or just 10% or something like that? Has that been thought out?
Well, it's a 10-year agreement, so I think if they renege,
It's everything.
I would think it's
That's
everything.
the way it's drafted now.
I know,
There
I know,
there is,
yeah.
if you look at the farm code open space, there's sort of a sliding scale depending upon how long it's been. But I think, once again, the idea here is to have people make historic
it's,
preservation, to make it preserve it for that period of time and not to jump out of the program the second a better.
who is the authority for that? Is that would that be the historic board or
Well, the board, the tax assessor would be involved.
tax?
The board would be involved in terms of determining whether they've
So maybe that's
complied or
another
not.
thing that gets established in the early years of, right after the board is formed or something like
I mean,
that.
that is something that we would want to tighten up in the ordinance itself.
Yeah.
Prior to it being adopted by the council.
Okay, that's all.
But as drafted right now.
Well, I don't know.
If you didn't keep it
I-
for the entire, as drafted right now, if it wasn't in the program for the entire 10-year term contract,
Yeah,
the town would recoup the entire benefit.
yeah.
Is that something you are comfortable with or uncomfortable with?
Well, I'm just thinking, I was trying to think of an example, and I haven't come up with one yet, but it could be that somebody was, loyal to the program for 9 years, but then for some reason had,
Conditions.
yeah.
Differently?
But anyway, that can be figured out later. Let's open it up to the
I got
public.
one.
Another
This
comment?
is sort of a personal thing, but I see stone walls are not eligible here. Stone walls are one of my favorite things. I happen to live in a house that has a stone wall. It's over 300 years old. It is 200 feet of it, and it was in very sad shape when I moved into my house. So I got an estimate to fix it, and I was going to probably have to take out a second and third mortgage. So I went and learned how to repair stone walls. So I incentivized myself, and it cost me my labor. But I think stone walls are an important part of this town. And I think we might want to incentivize people to either repair them themselves or have somebody come do it, because I think they're additive to the visual architectural landscape we have in
So,
town.
again, the way, I think I hear what you're saying, the way the draft reads now, it's walls that are covered under the town ordinance, which are stone walls abutting public ways. But I think I understand what you're saying is why wouldn't you want to incentivize a property owner to improve those stone walls? Sure, they're protected by the ordinance, but there's nothing making those or improving those walls.
You may, once again, as Ron said, the rationale was they're protected by the ordinance anyway, so we don't need to incentivize you to maintain them. But maybe, once again, maybe the rehab credit might be an appropriate way of
Yeah.
encouraging people
Yeah,
to
because
fix one that's in disrepair.
I think you either notice them or you don't. I mean, a lot of them are in very prominent places we see every day when we ride around town. So my wall looks great now, so I'm not going to get anything. But I just think that for others, it might be something to think about.
Is that completely on your property?
Yes.
So where the problem becomes is when it's dividing a property line.
Yeah.
And if
Right,
you-
unless both property owners wish to cooperate in getting into the program.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's not a bad thing to consider. I think that's a good incentive but they've got to collaborate, they've got to work together on it, because that can be a tricky thing, but it's still a good incentive.
Well, fortunately for me, my neighbor is the land trust, who has preserved 23 acres of trees. So that's my neighbor, and that's fine. So.
Not my day.
Okay, let's open it up to the public. Anyone from the public? John?
I would just want to commend you on exploring this, because I think it is a very important aspect of the town, and I think it's well worth creating an incentive program. So I was just going to touch on a couple of things that are handled at the federal level, just to reassure you how they've done it over a number of years. So I was on the Rhode Island Historic Preservation Heritage Commission for 28 years, and I believe in '76 they started, but they didn't really get much traction until around 1980. And their incentive program is substantially more on the rehab side. So I was just going to suggest that if the properties that are identified, the 114 or whatever the number ends up being, what I think you're all espousing is you want those properties to be maintained. You would like the owners to spend dollars, maybe significant dollars, on the repair of those facilities. in the Rhode Island Historic Preservation and Heritage, through the federal program, they give it 20%. They have a 5-year hold on the right, so it's like a 5-year contract, not a 10-year contract, but that's similar, right? And then if you're not able to use the 20% your first year against your taxes, it does carry forward. And the only reason I bring it up is that it's tried and true. You know, they've been doing it now for better part of 50 years, and they were originally at 30, they've gone down to 20. And I think that amount of incentive makes it worthwhile. I think if you want people to put on, you know, a wood roof versus an asphalt roof, that's going to be the historic board that will help them sort of go through those various decisions. But I would simply suggest that you want to encourage the best visual appearance that's historically appropriate for the house. And oftentimes, the material upgrade is expensive. And so I think that's what this program might be about, and I think it's entirely justified to think, and maybe explore it over a period of time, but I personally believe as an architect, the incentive is really worth it. You're going to find that those properties that are restored and repaired to a standard that really embraces the historicism is really going to add value to the town as a place for people to want to live to. And I know you believe it. I'm just saying that the amount of the incentive, I would encourage it to be a little bit bigger because I think it's important, especially when we don't have that many historic homes in Middletown, not compared to, you know, Portsmouth or Newport.
John,
But
can I ask?
Sure.
The program you just talked about that you were part of, they give, is it a grant that they give to the? Or-
it's a federal tax. So you're talking really about a property tax.
Right.
The federal government has a program in place they've had for the last 50 years, let's say, that actually gives the owner a tax credit against their federal tax. And when they're not able to use it for the year that they put it into service, then they allow that program to continue that tax credit. It's 20% now of both the exterior and the interior. This is a different program. You're looking at the exterior. You're
Right.
not really looking at people doing kitchen rehabs and giving them an opportunity for credit. It's really just, I think,
Right.
the
But
materials.
I think it's an important program. Maybe we can make reference to it. You know, we reference those documents there. Why can't we reference a program like that in the ordinance and give somebody who is looking to get into this program for the town that they may also have an opportunity
Oh, yeah.
with the federal, and they may not be aware of it, but if we put it in our documents, they might be able to do it themselves.
If I could interrupt, it's a little bit of a problem only in the sense that we don't have historic districts in Middletown. So in order
Okay.
for a historic property to be eligible for the federal program, they have to do a harder job than being in a district. You have to get your property listed separately.
I see.
And that's a big issue and a lot of time and energy. And I know we're not ready to do historic districts. And I really applaud your energy at creating out of whole cloth a new historic program. I just would encourage to make sure that there's enough there. I mean, the 10% discount on an annual tax, I think, I'm confident I could go talk to the tax assessor, say, you made a mistake. Could you look at my property and maybe I could get 10% anyway? So I'm just saying I wouldn't be afraid of giving a little bit more horsepower for that because it seems as though that isn't much. You know, I think like a 20% might be the appropriate amount. But I was arguing because I live in a historic house. I'd love to be able to, you know, keep putting money into the house so that, and I don't want to feel as though I'm now vulnerable to putting, you know, exterior painting on the house and only have the tax assessor, you know, come back and decide that my house is worth more money. So it's one of those things, you know, it's difficult. But I do applaud. I think it's really important for Middletown, and I think a noble effort to do this.
Well, I
So
think,
thank
John, I appreciate that, and I think that's something, that information we need to add to our package, and maybe the process, you need a federal thing on the house, right?
Right.
But there must be, well, how about the state? Does the state have an incentive program also?
They did. They've withdrawn it out of the success of the program. So, I mean, those are the,
Yeah.
but we're limited to the number of properties that we have here. So I don't
Yeah.
fear with 140 properties, if they all did everything, you just saw the numbers. They weren't too draconian. So I think you're okay. And I think it's well worth the energy and effort to do that.
So maybe we could add that as an information addendum to,
One of the things, it's a good point that John brings up, one of the things that we need in here is really a definition of what qualifies as a historically appropriate rehabilitation and maintenance project. And we may be able to take a look at that program and maybe borrow
incorporate it, yeah, okay.
standards for what,
So-
for what sort of a project, you know, if I just paint my house, is that enough? Or is it something more than that?
Right.
So how about, I mean, we had to pick a number at 10%, and Ron ran the numbers on it. What's to say we shoot higher, and we know the council's going to likely pull it back? And let's be honest, right? I mean, if it's a revenue thing, why not propose something higher
And let them
and
bring it
let
back.
them?
I would think that's a smart move. 20% would make a difference. I don't know that 10% is going to capture the hearts of that many people.
Just double
So-
the numbers that Ron put up there, right? The revenue impact. So if it's X amount of dollars, you just double it at 20, roughly. And I'm not opposed to that. I think start there and
Yeah.
let them say, hey, look at it, it's not.
I think that's a good idea also.
It's a worthy program.
Yeah.
I think where you're going is the right direction.
Settle for 15, I don't know.
Oh, put in
Thank you.
20, put in 20.
20,
Let-
20, yeah.
Town council will back it off to 15.
That's how I feel, I mean,
Yeah,
maybe
yeah,
the
no,
rest
I
of them-
agree with you, I agree with you.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anyone else from the public? Yes.
Roby Ferry and 9 Cardoza Terrace, Middletown. I read the proposed ordinance and feel that this is a really good idea whose time has come. I feel the financial incentives are appropriate, although maybe after listening to that gentleman, he has a great idea, and a generous offer from the town. My question is number 3, the density bonus. Middletown separated from Newport in 1743 and was known for its rich farmland. When you look through the Rhode Island Historical Preservation Commission 1979 preliminary report, most of the historical sites are farmhouses, outbuildings, and surrounding farmland. Is crowding more houses onto part of a historical vista in keeping with our agricultural history? Shouldn't the monetary incentive be sufficient? Adding another dwelling puts more strain on the town's services, whereas open areas require nothing. The preservation of the historic structure could be figured in to number 1 or 2 to encourage proper restoration. In the aforementioned report, some areas of the town were richer in historical sites, like Indian Avenue, if anybody had looked through it, Indian Avenue, like in Paradise Avenue. Maybe in the future, the zoning could be modified to protect these historically sensitive areas. Newport's Ocean Drive is zoned R160. Maybe that could be a future consideration. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else like to speak? Sure.
I want to go along with the upping the percentage before
Name
it goes
and,
to...
identify yourself.
Oh, I'm
please.
sorry, Terry Nunes, Khalil, Wyatt Road. And you know what's near and dear to my heart, same as ours, is the stone walls. And I have seen a lot of stone walls that have been repaired, and now they're in disrepair again. So I would like definitely to see the same thing with the stone walls, as far as a higher incentive for people to repair them. And I'm kind of going back, as I'd like to see the stone walls at 20%. Because when you start to look at the costs, you could get neighbors to pull together to do some work. Thanks.
Thank you. Anyone else? No one?
I have another question.
Sure.
Ron, back to the process again. This is an ordinance, obviously, but then I see on page 9, we do have to amend the zoning ordinance at some point under 1904C, density bonus for historic preservation, is that?
That's regarding the density bonus.
So that's
for-
a
for
zoning ordinance
conservation.
amendment, potentially,
I'm looking at the wrong thing.
page 9. And on that same note, page 10 is the rules and regs. But more importantly, I
Right.
guess, is the zoning. Is that gonna require a zone change application and all that? Public
This-
hearing here and all that good stuff?
That's a good point, yes. So if you proceed with the density bonus for conservation subdivision, then this language would have to be added into the zoning ordinance. So we would go through the standard zoning ordinance process just for those particular sections. I
And
think
also
it's-
the rules and regs?
And the rules and regs, right, yep.
So my only point on that is that that will open up more discussion at a public meeting on the ordinance in general. May not be applicable if they institute the ordinance and then say change the zoning and the rules and regs. It will just keep it out there, so we need to be a lot tighter with it.
Yeah.
Before we're, not ready for prime time, I think, at this point, but very close.
Yeah.
As much work as we've done.
Yeah, I mean, the purpose of this meeting was really to get a feel for whether we want to proceed at all, and if so, what are the major components that we want to make sure that we work with. I think we've gotten some good feedback about the need for making the incentive something that's really attractive to property owners. Why adopt an ordinance of this type if it's not going to get used?
So I have 3 items that we should reconsider. One of them is the rehabilitation of stone walls, which we could put in there. The second is 20% instead of 10% for the annual, for the,
Incentive.
well,
Tax credit.
the 10-year incentive. Or for both incentives, 1 and 2. Run the numbers and see what they
Yeah,
look
we
like.
can-
Double that, I would say
Okay.
10 and 20.
And the third is the question that was raised, if we increase the financial incentive, do we still need the added lot incentive?
Right.
Do we still need the one, I'm sorry?
The added lot that the developer
Okay.
gets.
One of the-
Sure.
Now, if we do the 20% price to 10%, we're still limited by the total tax, right?
I believe so. There's still a limit on the total.
Well,
Up to
what John was suggesting too is, I guess under the federal program, that tax benefit can carry,
Carry forward. So let's say you had 20%.
To the mic.
I'm just saying that's the way to do the federal program. I'm not saying you have to do it this way, but let's say you had a tax of $5,000 a year, but you had 20%, and it garnered you $10,000 of a tax credit. So that's 2 years' worth of taxes. So you'd have 1 year paid, so it wouldn't be too much on a strain in the city. You know, you don't want to bankrupt the city on it. Just carry that forward another year so that you can use up the tax credit that way. And then you had it tied a lot to the maximum, which was the
medium home value.
medium
Yeah.
home. I mean, that's an interesting way to do it. It's what you really want to do, and I'm just fighting to get people who own historic properties to feel like, oh, there's something here
Make it
for me,
worthwhile.
you know? And you're just really only talking about the exterior. The exterior of the house is only 30% of the cost. You know, the other 70% usually goes into plumbing and fixtures and electricity and all these other things that they're not going to get any benefit on. So that's why I guess I'm a proponent to consider a little bit higher on the exterior incentive. And yes, I think painting alone would be good to have. You know, whatever you do on the outside, assuming that it's not going to hurt the edifice, that you're not going to dilute the historic value of the edifice, I think would go towards those qualified expenses. And, but that's going to be something for the historic board to consider, figure out what is important. But you really want to get people to think about a historic home in Middletown as being worthy of being saved. That's what the whole point is here. And I'm just a proponent for giving them a little bit more horsepower, because if it isn't much, all this hard work that you're going through may not really save anything. That's all.
It's a tug of war.
So we could, if we say we went to 20%, we could limit the amount that could be awarded any one year, but any excess could be carried over.
If that's what you
Yeah,
want to do.
yeah, I think that's a good idea. Makes it a better incentive, I agree. Any other comments? John?
Ron, I've got a question for you. Let's say somebody decides to rehab their house. There are certain standards that they're going to have to abide by. Who judges the quality of the rehab work?
It's going to be the board. The Historic Resources Board is going to have the
After
responsibility.
it's done, they go judge the quality of the workmanship, the proper materials?
Right.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. They would approve the project in advance and then would confirm with some documentation that the project was done in accordance with what was approved.
Great, thank you.
I've got one other question. I think I know the answer, but I want to be clear on it. On the density bonus, I'm a major developer. The property I'm going to develop and rehab can be any place in town. It's not on the property I'm going to develop. Is that correct?
It's good, no, the idea is that it would be tied to that property.
Okay.
If you're
So-
subdividing a property that's got an historic house on it,
Okay. So it's got to be on that, contiguous to that property?
that's the way it's drafted now, yes.
Okay, it's just not some house out there someplace in space?
Right,
Okay.
yep.
Other comments? So,
We've got some work to do, some more investigation
I
to do.
think we need another draft,
Yes,
yeah. We can close the public hearing for tonight?
it's not a formal public hearing, but,
We never opened it.
yeah.
We never opened it. The workshop is open, remains open. We'll probably come back for another workshop.
Yeah.
Any other comments from the board? We have a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. Motion, meeting's adjourned.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your comments. Appreciate them very much.